Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, the Director of Shelter Solutions at Maddie's Fund. Welcome to Maddie's Monthly Behavior Connection, a monthly webcast that's all about animal behavior. Our guest today is Valerie Bogie. Valerie graduated from the University of Tennessee with her Master of Science in Social Work and a Veterinary Social Work certificate. She has a unique background in veterinary social work and animal behavior and currently leads human support services for Insight Animal Behavior Services in Chicago, which is a veterinary behaviorist practice, and also provides psychoeducation and consulting through Valerie Bogie LLC. I'm really excited to have her here as she's such a unique individual who I feel has a lot to offer us. Welcome, Valerie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, not only to you, but also to Maddie's Fund for having me here today. I think this is such an important topic and something near and dear to my heart because, as you mentioned, I have been in a lot of arenas in animal care, including the shelter world. And I just recognize how difficult it can be. And when we have such passion for the animals and recognizing that sometimes it is really tough and really talking about how can we move forward from that? How can we work towards compassion, satisfaction, and resilience? So let me get my things here. All right, so we should be able to see slides. Okay, so you heard the words veterinary social worker. So I hope that some of you watching have a veterinary social worker at your shelter. But the reality is that many of you do not. Some of you might not even know what a veterinary social worker is, as this is still an emerging field. As a veterinary social worker, one of my goals is to support the human animal bond, and that is the human side, right? It is the emotional needs, it is the well being in any facet of the human animal interaction. And that is everyone watching together today. So, veterinary social work started in 2002 by Dr. Elizabeth Strand at the University of Tennessee. It continues to grow, and the International Association of Veterinary Social Work, or IAVSW, is helping to bring it to other countries. So you can see here, there's kind of four main sections of veterinary social work that University of Tennessee started out with. And some of those might resonate with you, right? So the intentional well-being we'll be touching on today, animal-related grief and bereavement we'll touch a little bit on next month, but also things you might interact with as far as the link between human and animal violence when we're dealing with animal abuse or domestic violence. Also animal-assisted interventions, and that's really looking into service animals, therapy animals, and things like that. So with the IAVSW, we added a fifth pillar for that one, and that is just recognizing that there is also an environmental impact on the human-animal relationship. So just to review what our learning goals for our time together today are, we really want to explore the stress response and how stress that you're going through every single day is impacting your brain and your body. We also want to talk about the importance of compassion satisfaction and how to cultivate that. And last but not least, everyone loves some tools and you need them, right? And you also need to figure out what tools are working best for you. So giving you a variety of suggestions and tools that can be helpful for you in your journey. So first, we got to talk a little bit about stress. So I want to first highlight the fact that stress is a natural response. It is something we all experience. It is part of being human. The other part of this that is inevitable, change. Life is not static, it is fluid and ever changing. Recognizing that stress is our normal, natural response to change is the first step to understand ourselves a little bit better. We also need to understand that stress is not good or bad. Both are necessary to give us feedback. Use stress moves you forward, like meeting a deadline, being a little nervous before a speech, or failing when you try something new for the first time. Distress is prolonged stress. It keeps you stagnant. It keeps you stuck. There is too much stress piling up. When we are dealing with chronic stress, we may not get a true reprieve from stress, and this continued exposure can lead to additional challenges, such as changes in patterns of sleep, eating, interest in hobbies, socialization, and can increase risk of physical conditions like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and more. Maybe all this human stuff is a little foreign to you. So let's talk in terms you might be a little bit more familiar with, like fear-free spectrum of fear, anxiety, and stress. Don't forget, we are large mammals. Just like the dogs and other species in your care, too much distress can have long-term impacts. So remembering that this type of spectrum is also tied to brain function. So green is good. Green means all systems go in the brain. And what happens when we exit green, whether it's us or the animals? Something goes offline. A very important part of our brain, that is the prefrontal cortex. That is responsible for a lot of important functions, like learning new things, recalling something you already know, emotional regulation, and problem solving. So just that reminder that for us as the human component of all of this, when we are in that red area, that FAS 4 and 5, we are also over threshold. There is too much going on in our brain and our body to really function properly. And what comes up instead? That amygdala response with that flight, fight, freeze. So just recognizing that which we see in the animals is also occurring in us as well. Here's some terms you've probably already heard of before. And they're all surrounding distress, and they all can be applicable to those working in the animal welfare arena. So we're going to do a little just review of what these mean, but then we're going to spring forward because I don't like staying here on these, and I'll tell you a little bit more why in a little bit here. So burnout and compassion fatigue. I think these are probably the most common things that we hear in the animal welfare world about what our experience is. So burnout is usually the experience of no longer having a desire to do your chosen area of work. Typically, you just want to leave the profession. You don't even want to do it anymore. Burnout is usually related to the job environment, such as lack of personal or organizational support and a heavy, heavy workload. You also might feel isolated. You might also be dealing with physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. And you might not feel like your work is actually doing any good or that you're really making a difference. It also can lead to decreased motivation and negative attitudes towards yourself and to others around you. So a key thing to remember for burnout, it is not only in helping professions. Anyone in any professional world can experience burnout. And when we think about the term burnout, it seems very final, as if there's no way to come back from it, which is not true. Just remember that you can relight your candle and get your spark back. Talking about compassion fatigue, according to Dr. Elizabeth Strand, who was the founder of Veterinary Social Work at University of Tennessee, it is the result of caring very much and working very, very hard and not recognizing and caring for your own needs. You might have also heard it called The Cost of Caring by Charles Figley. This is typically associated with helping care for humans or animals, so it really is more focused on the helping professions. Many of the signs of compassion fatigue overlap with burnout. The exhaustion, feeling overwhelmed, unsure if you're making a difference, decreased motivation, and reduced feelings of empathy. Next, I'm going to share a story with you to help illustrate these terms. My story does include a dog bite, so this is a trigger warning for that. So when I worked at an animal shelter, I fell in love with Andrew, who I fostered and ultimately foster failed back in October of 2015. He and my male dog, Wiley, started having aggression issues. So my brother-in-law, Ben, adopted him. So fast forward to a couple of years ago, 2023, my husband and I and our dogs moved back in with Ben. We had great management, kept the dogs separate. And this night in particular, myself, my brother-in-law Ben, and my husband were all hanging out outside. It had a little fire pit going, and Andrew was curled up on my lap. So cute, in fact, I took these pictures. My husband and my brother-in-law were burning wood in that fire pit. They ran out of wood. So what do they burn instead? Cardboard boxes. They put one on the fire pit. I didn't think anything of it, but the wind picked up and it blew the box towards us. This was a flaming on fire box coming towards me and this cute little donut of a dog. And what do? You scream. Without thinking, I brought him with me. Well, what happened from Andrew's eyes? Suddenly there's fire, there's screaming, and he got jostled and startled very, very quickly. He started biting my face. I don't think I've ever screamed louder in my entire life. And we went and got it treated at the ER. So there was one full puncture wound through my lip. It was absolutely terrifying. And my heart is racing just talking about it right now. So luckily I didn't need stitches and obviously fully recovered. But that experience for me is an example of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. That night and many nights afterwards, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept replaying those events in my head. And that replaying of events and nightmares is a typical symptom of PTSD. We decided to leave Ben's house for a little bit. We had an RV at the time, and we went to a state park for a few weeks because the sight of Andrew and being in the house was just so triggering and stressful for me. So avoidance of the individuals and places associated with the traumatic event is also a typical symptom of PTSD. Other symptoms of PTSD can include having increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle responses, as well as negative changes in beliefs about themselves, the world, or the future. I did ask my brother-in-law to take Andrew to the vet. While I understood it was a high-stress situation, that just seemed like an abnormal response for him. I, in many ways, was his person. He took him to the vet, and come to find out, he had a torn ACL. So if you know anything about the relationship between pain and behavior, this was a great example of how that affected his behavior in that moment. He did have surgery and had a full recovery, and he's still running around to this day. So listening to my story or stories from others about traumatic experiences and events is considered secondary traumatization, or STS, which stands for secondary traumatic stress. This is when a helper listens to a story of a trauma and then themselves, they start to feel similar traumatic effects, similar to PTSD, like disturbed sleep, intrusive thoughts, or images. You might also experience vicarious trauma by hearing stories like mine. So vicarious trauma, similar to the secondary traumatic stress, is associated with direct experience of hearing stories of intense emotional or physical suffering, where STS tends to be a little bit more of an acute stress response, where vicarious trauma causes to transform things on a longer timeline. So Charles Figley, who has done a lot of research in these arenas, reports that he thinks that vicarious trauma is a cumulative and permanent effect. In other words, once you hear a story of violence, there's no going back to your original mindset before you heard the story. For this reason, people who experience vicarious trauma have an altered worldview, and their sense of safety is very different due to that cumulative effect, prolonged empathetic exposure to trauma. So the main take-home points of all of this is when we think about burnout, that can happen to any profession, and compassion fatigue is helping professions only. And then when we think about PTSD, that is where you directly have experienced the event, and then secondary traumatization and vicarious trauma are hearing of other stories or traumas that they're sharing with you. So as you can see on this chart here, there's a lot of overlap, and you can actually be experiencing more than one at the same time. So I find it more helpful to focus a little less on the label and more about how to address that actual stress response. Next, I want to talk a little bit more about other things that can contribute to our stress response in the animal welfare world. So, this one's a big one. We are human. We are not perfect. We typically give the animals in our care grace and understanding that they make mistakes, but not ourselves. So, we really need to reframe this. We need to reframe what a mistake actually is. A mistake is information to the learner. A mistake is an opportunity to make changes for next time. If you can start to accept the fact that you will inevitably make mistakes, you are opening up the opportunity to actually learn from them. This will help make the whole process a little bit easier. If you fester over mistakes and get into that self blame spiral, this will only add to your distress. An ethical dilemma involves a situation with multiple ethically justifiable options, but no clear best choice, which forces a difficult decision. A couple examples you might encounter might be weighing an animal's quality of life versus the shelter's mission and current resources for that animal. Or maybe when you have to prioritize animals for care or adoption, and some decisions have to be made about the long term confinement of maybe some more unadoptable animals. An ethical dilemma can be the situation that does lead to moral distress. Moral distress is a psychological and emotional suffering that occurs when an individual knows the ethically correct action but is prevented from taking it. And that can be due to some external constraints. It can be caused by some of that right versus wrong dilemma and is often characterized by anxiety and unrest. In these situations, a person's deeply held core beliefs are violated, and ultimately, this leads to adverse outcomes for self or others. This might look like an inability to deliver the appropriate level of care to a patient due to resource shortages, euthanizing an animal with a treatable condition, but the owner cannot afford treatment, and more. So, talking about all the ways that you might have stress enter your world in your work life, we also need to recognize all of the negative impacts of stress. These are affecting your behavior, your brain function, sometimes even physical changes as well. So, as you start to look at this list, it's also helpful to have an additional awareness of these to recognize them, not only in yourself, but also in those around you and your coworkers as well. Because sometimes we might not see it in ourselves. So, it can be nice to have someone else point some of these things out to you. Um, so, a couple helpful tools we can think about when we're talking about stress, right? Because sometimes it might seem hard to measure, right? Like, how stressed are you today versus last week or 3 years ago or anything like that? If we don't have a solid way to measure that stress, it could be difficult to see if we're improving. Are things getting better? So here's a couple examples of ways that you can measure your stress and your well-being. So one you might be familiar with is called the ProQual, that it stands for the Professional Quality of Life. That gives scores in different categories, such as compassion satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. There's the Perceived Stress Scale, or the PSS, that helps us to understand how different situations affect our feelings and our perceived stress. The questions in this scale ask you about your feelings and thoughts during the last month. So, for either of those first two surveys, you can take them on your own periodically throughout the year as a nice little check in for yourself. You can also have your team take one or both and then have a wellness focused team meeting to gain a little bit more understanding of how everyone is doing and open up that conversation. If you're working with a licensed mental health professional, you can work with them to be assessed for PTSD, anxiety, depression, and more. Even our current fitness trackers and smartwatches can help monitor our heart rate variability, which is called HRV, which shows the variation in time between heartbeats. A lower HRV is often associated with higher stress. If you like data, you like a little research, you might be familiar with the fact that there's still a lot of emerging research in the animal welfare world, but it is coming, and the stuff that's out there so far is pretty interesting. So one of the more recent studies was done in 2023 and then published in 2024 by Wolf et al. And they basically gave surveys. So they used the ProQual, they used another one called Promise, and surveyed 243 animal welfare staff members, and started to look for trends. So here in this chart, you can also see that little orange dot, which is the present study, compared to the results and data from other studies for different populations. So I just thought this was really interesting because so many times we feel isolated. We feel like, oh, this is, this is the worst. We have this negativity bias in our brain. But recognizing hard is hard, right? And you notice the present study is actually pretty close to some of those other numbers near other previous shelter studies. But also look at all of these. These are a lot of caring professions, animal care professions, animal lab techs, dog fosters, even some human caretakers as well. So just looking at this measure as far as comparing the compassion satisfaction with the job versus some of that secondary traumatic stress that they might be experiencing. So very excited about continuing to find and share additional research in this arena because it is really interesting. And that's part of the solution, is figuring out what are the toughest parts and how can we work towards those solutions. So, on that note, we're going to talk a lot about compassion, satisfaction, and resilience because I am tired of focusing on burnout. I'm tired of focusing on compassion fatigue. And all of those other terms we've already covered. Because what is that doing? That is holding us back. That is focusing on the negative. That is focusing on the problems, but not solutions focused. Our brains do have a negativity bias. So what that means is we are wired to automatically give more attention, more weight, and focus to negative outcomes. This is how we've survived as a species this long, but it can work against us when we are trying to increase our positive outlook on our life and our work. Focusing on labeling ourselves with burnout, compassion fatigue, etc., only feeds into that negativity bias. So we want to move towards compassion satisfaction. So you can recognize that that's pleasure, right? Those are the good parts that are derived from helping others. And what gets us there? Resilience. And resilience is the ability to cope, learn, and grow from difficult experiences. When we talk about what factors are impacting resiliency, we can start with these. There's usually more, but we'll start with these. So, workload. How many animals are you caring for? How many animals are you training? How many hours are you working? How many responsibilities do you have in your workday? How many people are you managing? Those newer to the field have not navigated as many stressful situations as those that have been in the field for a very long time. So the years of experience does play into resiliency, because when you're newer, you might doubt your abilities. You might not have kind of a play-by-play, step-by-step what you do in these higher stress situations. So per the Merck veterinary studies, more young veterinarians have serious psychological distress than did older veterinarians. That study was done in 2017 and 2019. And as I mentioned, there continues to be more studies on animal welfare workers, but we can see a lot of parallels between veterinary professionals as well as animal welfare workers, because obviously there's veterinarians there as well. When we think about self-awareness, it's that lack of ability to recognize when you are stressed that can reduce your ability to proactively change your environment. So building self-awareness can be helpful with that. Do you know right now what activities help reduce your stress response? Having coping strategies that work for you is imperative to becoming more resilient. When you are at that FAS5 red over threshold, that is not the time to be thinking of things that you could try to do. We want them to be that knee-jerk reaction of things that you know in your toolbox that work for you as an individual. Having ideas and plans in place before reaching that high stress situation is going to be helpful, which we're going to discuss shortly here. That last one, Boundaries. Lack of or weak boundaries can increase our stress levels. Being available or on all the time is exhausting. So how do we build resilience? How do we increase resilience? Right? So with the tough workload, how do we manage a schedule better? How do we uh, start to ask for help? How do we build a stronger team? How do we, look at protocols and things to support that workload so it's not so heavy on any one individual or team? Years of experience. That does just take time, but how can you promote learning if you have been around for a while? How are you teaching the newcomers to help them build those skills as quickly as they can? To build your own self-awareness, you can think about having some reflection time built into your day. Maybe it's just your drive home where you just gotta think through your day. Maybe it's journaling, coping strategies, box breathing, grounding exercises. We're going to go through those in a moment. And boundaries. I love a good auto reply and I love it on all of the time, right? Because what that does is gives you peace of mind to say, hi, I am in and out of the office. Here's what you can expect for a response. What are your work week hours look like? How long? Give yourself 24 to 48 hours, 72 if you're like us for insight. We have 72 hours, right? But it's a clear expectation so people aren't as upset because things are being clear. Also silencing notifications, maybe deleting whatever apps you have for work off your phone if you can, so you're not constantly checking them when you are physically not at work any longer. So some of those smaller steps are hard, and I understand that. So, but just thinking about them in some spaces where you might be able to improve your own well-being by doing some of these things is really, really helpful. We use the 5 domains to measure welfare in the animals under our care. But what about you? These same domains actually apply and can be helpful reminders of where to start when formulating a self-care plan. I like to think about number one first, is, food, water. Have you eaten today? How much water have you drank? Is that why you have a headache right now? And also too, it's a helpful reminder that self-care doesn't have to be a bubble bath or a pedicure. It doesn't have to be anything lavish. Sometimes self-care really is going back to the basics. Because we know when we are stressed out and our prefrontal cortex is offline, it can be really hard to function normally. So just thinking about what are your basic needs and working on meeting those really, really well. Because one of the most restorative things for our body and brain, especially when we're stressed out, is sleep. Number two is spending time outside and in the environment, but then also too, meeting those basic needs of food, water, and moving your body can be really helpful in those high times of stress. If you like a visual, if you like a checklist, there's also the Healthy Mind Platter. So this has 7 essential activities that are necessary for optimum mental health in daily life. So these kind of make up the full set of mental nutrients, if you want to think of them that way, that your brain needs to function at its best. So by engaging every day in these types of servings, you enable your brain to coordinate and balance its activities, which essentially strengthens your brain's internal connections and connections to other people. So there's not a specific recipe for this necessarily because everyone is a different, unique individual, and your needs can change over time. So the point is to become aware of the full spectrum of mental activities and make sure that at least every day we're nudging the right ingredients into our mental diet, even for just a little bit. If you're interested in this, you can go to the website for the Healthy Mind Planner. There's also a way you can track and take a little data on yourself as far as day to day. Which ones are you hitting? Where are you lacking? So that over time you can build a better plan for yourself to really make sure that you're offering as much self-care to yourself as you're able to. Awesome. Da-da-da. All right. So that's all fine and dandy, but what about in those moments where your heart is racing, your mind is racing, you're sweaty, you're just so stressed out in the moment, it might feel like you're stuck and there's not a thing you can do to help yourself until you leave. That is not true. There are a lot of different ways that you can help regulate yourself in the moment when you recognize your stress levels are starting to rise. So we're going to go over a couple of those techniques. So one is box breathing. It's used by Navy SEALs. It's used by a lot of, it's used in yoga, and it is exactly what it sounds like. So you can visualize that box on the left-hand side, and it's a deep breathing technique. And what it's doing is helping to regulate your sympathetic nervous system, which is our flight, fight, freeze response. So it's starting to regulate that, starting to de-escalate you on that FAS scale, and it helps to reduce your stress, lower your blood pressure, and give you a little bit of a sense of calm. Because when we are stressed, when we're anxious, we're usually only breathing out of the top half of our lungs, and that can increase our anxiety and stress in those moments. So really taking those moments to do these really big, deep breaths can be helpful. If you like a different visual, there's the little kind of pulsing circle on the right-hand side. And so every time it opens, we can breathe in for 4, closes, you hold, opens again, out for 4, right? So whatever tool you feel like is going to be good for you. But just recognizing this also gives you a moment to kind of tune back into your body in those very stressed out moments. The 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique is a mindfulness exercise that helps you focus on the present moment and also can help reduce your anxiety. It involves using your 5 senses to identify things around you. So, similar to box breathing, it can help bring your brain out of flight, fight, and freeze. So, to increase the effectiveness, you can also practice this while sitting on the ground or standing in the grass without your shoes on. But really, it's as simple as it seems. So, what are 5 things you can see right now? I see my mouse, I see my water bottle, I see a nail file, right? So you're just looking around and taking that moment to just bring yourself back into that present moment, because a lot of times with anxiety, we get those racing thoughts and we're kind of a mile a minute going ahead. So this kind of pulls us back and gives us a moment to just be present and breathe. Some people, like myself, have a hard time remembering what order the senses are in. There are some really cool stickers and things out there that you can get if you need that reminder. But something I remember a little bit more easily for myself is rainbow order, right? So if that makes more sense for you, try it out. It's very similar. So with this one, instead of the 5 senses, we're going through and looking for things in our world at that moment that match these colors. So you're going to go in the order of the rainbow, and you're going to look for an object near you. And then you're going to think about what's the texture, what's the size, what are some attributes about that object before we moved on to the next thing. You can also do a rainbow grounding walk, where then you are moving your body while doing this exercise outside. And that can be extra restorative for you. Name it to tame it is a strategy coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. This helps to reduce stress and anxiety by noticing and verbally labeling emotions, which helps us to calm your nervous system and gain a sense of control over your reactions. So if you need help figuring out how to describe how you're feeling, the emotion cessation wheel is a great place to start. You might be familiar with Brene Brown. She's done a lot of research in human emotions, and her research showed that the average human can only define 3 emotions: happy, sad, and angry. But there is so much more. In order for us to understand and process our emotions or build better communication with others, we need to work on expanding our own emotional vocabulary. We can also experience more than one emotion at a time. It can be helpful to check in with yourself. What are 2 words on here that help explain how you're feeling today? You can also use this as a helpful check-in to the start of a team meeting, just to get a pulse for how the team is doing. Now, let's say you have sweaty palms and a racing heart, but you can't exactly put your finger on the emotion. That's why I like this one specifically, because it's got the sensations on the outside. So you can kind of match up where you feel on the outside and then work your way in to give yourself the tools and words to describe how you might be feeling. So instead of saying, I'm burned out, what can you say instead? I'm exhausted. I'm depressed. I am hurt, right? That actually lets someone know how you are doing in that moment. It helps you assess how you're doing versus some of these blanket statements of I'm burned out or I'm fatigued, right? So just thinking about it in that way can be helpful, not only to you, but others around you as well. And boundaries. So these do help reduce the stress response because it's the preventative maintenance. And it's preventative versus being reactive. It's also empowering yourself to be able to say no. So, like I said, the auto reply, even if you're in the office, can be helpful, and set expectations, trying not to check work chats and email and things like that at home, because that can lead to rumination over issues and situations that you cannot change in that moment. And sometimes that can take away from your downtime when you aren't at work if you're constantly thinking about all the things there as well. Something else that can be really helpful when we are stressed out is community, right? So, building community and understanding can also increase resilience. So, many times we are struggling, we feel isolated and alone. So, increase open communication with your coworkers and your supervisors and find ways to insert time to debrief and time for fun. You can also think about working through your feelings and experiences with a veterinary social worker or other mental health professionals. You can also communicate with a giant network of amazing humans in the shelter world through Maddie's Fun forums. There's also so many other supports out there. Again, just tools that you should be aware of so that if you need them or someone you know needs them, you have access to them. So here's a quick list of those as well. So as we wrap up, just a reminder of some of the things that we covered today. Um, really just helping you to understand some of those signs of distress, the reasons behind them, because we have to have that awareness and understanding to be able to help yourself and others. Because we want to move away from compassion fatigue, away from burnout. We want to move towards compassion satisfaction. We want to build resiliency in ourselves and in our teams. And there's lots of tools. So I hope I shared enough with you so you can at least try a couple on. Also, too, there's no wrong way to use those tools, and getting curious about them and recognizing, hey, maybe one of these will work for me, is one of the first steps that you can do for yourself, to improve your well-being. So for this part one, we took a deep dive into discussing brain states and the communication, and all of these things, and the stress response. And stay tuned for part two, that we're going to cover next month. So thank you so much for joining us. This QR code leads to that Linktree website is in progress, but the Linktree kind of has all of the some of the tools and things that we're talking about together today. And then if you want to get in touch with me, by all means, and then to give credit to some of my sources that I use today, we have that as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Valerie. This is an amazing presentation. And I first saw a different version of this presentation through Michael Shikashio's website, Aggressive Dog. And every time I listen to it, I learn something new. So thank you so much. We are going to jump in to questions now. And just a reminder, if anybody has to leave early, that just as Valerie said, there is a part two to this next month. First question is about vicarious trauma. And the question is it becoming more prevalent with the increase in true crime dramas and shocking news stories? Do we feel more suspicious or unsafe now versus in the pre-social media era?
Ooh.
Big one.
That is a good one. I don't have any data to support that, but that thought process makes complete sense, right? Where, yeah, even just watching those things, right? Like it has a little eustress to it, right? Because you're like, ooh, this is a little scary, but I know I'm safe because this isn't happening to me. This is on TV. But yeah, great question. What are the long-term effects, if that's the type of media that you continue to consume? Versus someone that might choose the not true crime things like that. So yeah, I think more exposure to those things can definitely increase some of that trauma for sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Wendy, I see that your hand is raised. If you do, in fact, have a question, we can unmute you so you can ask that. But if, oh, it was raised accidentally, you just, oh, I think it was an accidental raise, but type in chat if you do want to unmute and ask your question live. You're welcome to do that. Our next question, another really good one. How can I encourage colleagues to set boundaries for themselves? I try to model the behavior, but that doesn't seem to have much of an effect.
Modeling is great. I love that. Right. Leading by example. But I think that's a bigger question because then to me, that is how can we change the policies and procedures of the organization to support the staff? Because if there's not clear guidelines about what we are supposed to do or not do on off time or, some of those things, that's where we get this gray area and the muddy waters. And that's where people say, oh, well, I'll just check one more time. Or people expect me to email after my workday is over. And sometimes our brains start to tell us and make up some of those things when it's actually completely different than what our supervisors or the organization expectations are. So I think increasing communication about what's the expectation versus the individual's behavior surrounding some of those things. And is there a way that we can create additional policies and procedures to support that, right? Because if it's not spelled out anywhere, then right? Someone might have a little bit more anxiety about things, so they are the ones constantly checking and things like that. But if there's something in place to say, please don't do that, or here, here's our order of operations instead, that can help reduce that individual's anxiety. So hopefully over time, we can kind of reduce some of those behaviors with true boundaries that are coming from up top, which are usually hopefully a little bit easier to follow because it is, for the well-being of the entire organization.
Great. Thank you. That was super helpful. Our next question is, how can I best support a coworker who seems burned out or has compassion fatigue?
Ask them how they're doing. So something that's on my link tree that you can find. So it's a 1-hour intro to emotional CPR. So emotional CPR was created by a bunch of mental health professionals and people that have experienced traumatic events to be a peer-to-peer support. So it's really trying to train us how to be a better active listener when we recognize someone is having a hard time. So there's a 1-hour race approved webinar on that link tree of mine. And so many times we just want to be heard, right? Because especially when you are in a helping profession and you have all this knowledge in your brain and you just want to help somebody, we don't give them the time to just share, right? We just go into automatic triage mode of, well, yeah, you're burned out, or you said just take a day off, or can you do that, right? We just go into solving without really letting them share authentically their experience. Not any fault of ours because we are products of our environment. So if you didn't have adults in your world as you were growing up model active listening and some of those skills, you're not very good at it, but you can grow it. So starting with something like that course can also give you some tools of what to say to someone when you recognize that they're having a hard time to help them and just be with them, right? Because in some of these situations, there's nothing we can fix, but being present, being there for them without stealing the narrative or telling them what to do can be one of the best ways we can support people that are struggling.
Great. Thank you. And I see some hearts going up showing people really appreciated your response to that. It looks like we're reaching the end of the questions. Next question is related to, and I don't know if there's necessarily an answer to this, but how does someone know when the stress associated with a job is just too much and it's time to think about working somewhere else?
It's a good one. I think that we all have our own capacity, right? And at the end of the day, hard is hard. So if you're noticing all of these changes in your behavior, where you're noticing all those stress signals physically, mentally, emotionally, and it coincides with work, those are good indications that maybe that's not the best fit for you. And I think talking with a mental health professional that can help you unpack some of that, because just like we talk about some of the animals in the shelter, right? We have trigger stacking or cumulative stress, like you might call it. We deal with that too. So also there are times where, yes, work is heavy and hard because we're trying to do, our due diligence and help all these amazing animals. But what else is going on, right? Like, are you also upset with where you are in life? Are you having issues with friends or family, right? So understanding too that you are beautifully human and there's always a lot of spinning plates going on. So sometimes it can also be easy to say, yeah, it's all work, but sometimes working with someone to kind of unpack what else is going on in life, because it can make work harder in some of those cases. So I think getting curious about that. And for someone that has left a very amazing field, I used to work in zoos and aquariums, and also felt very burned out and had compassion fatigue. And I was just tired. And at some point, I was just like, the sacrifices I am making, is not worth it for me, right? Working on holidays and missing things with my family and having a bullying situation where I was working and things like that. Um, for me, I knew I needed a break. So things that helped me make that decision was I can go back at any time, right? There's always going to be more jobs. So if I leave for a period of time and I decide that, oh yeah, I do miss it, I do want to get back in, there's always going to be jobs. And that experience is always on your resume. So just knowing just because you're leaving doesn't mean you can't go back. And maybe there's just a different organization that might be a better fit for you as an individual. And I think also too, I think about those animals that I was caring for and loving on and doing, so much for them every single day. In my heart of hearts, I believed that they wouldn't want me to be that upset. They wouldn't want me to be that stressed out coming to care for them. So that also kind of helps me kind of think through and work through some of those things as well. But there's always going to be more jobs. And, maybe it's just a different institution, maybe it's a different job title, maybe there's something, right? And so, also too, if you think there's things that could change at work to support you a little bit better, maybe having those conversations. And then also recognizing maybe you're not the only one, right? Because if everyone's thinking the same things, but no one's talking about it, what kind of organizational change can you maybe move forward with to help everybody out if you really do decide that you want to stay? So I think there's a lot of different options there for sure.
Great, thank you. Next question. I am a volunteer. My challenge is most often with other volunteers. We are supposed to report changes in dog behavior, potentially unsafe behavior. I do this for the safety of the adopters, staff, volunteers, and other dogs. And the fact that you're justifying a little bit shows that how stressful this topic is. And I totally agree with how stressful it can be. Unfortunately, some volunteers have interpreted this as writing bad comments for dogs I don't like. So thinking that she's writing bad comments,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if the dog becomes final plea or is euthanized. This interpersonal drama just adds to other stresses. Any suggestions?
Mm. I think that is really tough. So I mean, yeah, like, oh, that's hard, right? Because you don't want to be the one that's putting the black mark on the dog's file or, that kind of thing. So I completely understand the stress that puts on the team, the volunteers, the staff, and everything. But I think what you're sharing just sounds like there needs to be a little bit more education for the volunteers about the why, right? Because if there's these significant behavior changes and it's uh, turning into a safety issue, yes, it's not great if we have to say goodbye to that animal, but also we don't want to put that and place that animal in a home where it could be a dangerous situation, right? So I think maybe there's just some reframing or education that needs to happen at that volunteer level. Um, or maybe you change how that's reported, right? Because being able to recognize body language and those signals is a skill, and it takes time to grow that skill. And being able to say objectively, like ears back, fur raised on spine, tense muscles, is different than he was really mad at me or he was really upset when I did blah, right? And so I think also too maybe some uh evaluation of how those things are getting reported, in addition to additional education about the why behind those things. Because you're right, yeah, it's a safety concern, and at the end of the day, you're looking at the welfare of the animals, as well as the safety for any potential adopters down the line. So I know it's a tough spot to be in, but I really appreciate that question.
Thanks, Valerie. And I agree. I would also say this really sounds like it's a culture issue with the animal shelter, and that expressing what's happening to leadership, obviously not with placing blame on the other volunteers, but just explain the stress that it's causing you for being honest. Um, Leadership will is really responsible for talking about this is why this is important and why we all need to be on the same page here. And yeah, because it happens, I know, but it's really unfair when you're trying to do the right thing and this happens. So sorry
Yeah.
you've experienced. All right. Our next question is, and this is an interesting one related to this topic. As an adoption counselor, how do you do your job and learn about the dogs to be able to get them adopted but not get attached to them?
You don't? Right? Like, that I was not on the adoption floor, but when I was at the shelter, so I was in the small dog area, and you do get it. I mean, I foster failed one, right? So that's the tough part, right? Of you are allowed to get attached to them because who's going to know them better? But I think also to maybe reframing what that relationship looks like, right? Because unfortunately, I don't think any of us can take home every animal that we fall in love with at a shelter or in any situation. So I think thinking about how you establishing that relationship or you spending time with them to get to know them is beneficial for that animal's welfare, right? You are spending time with them, you're doing some relationship building, you're getting to know them as best as you can with whatever time that you have. And that is a pay it forward thing, right? Because you are able to really know a little bit more about that animal to set that animal up for success to hopefully stay in the adopter's home that actually takes them home. So I think it's maybe that reframe of that. And also too, next month we're going to be talking about grief, and that's also a really great example of grief where the animal's not dying, the animal's getting adopted, and we're very excited, but we're also sad and bummed because we really liked that animal. So I think it's also appropriate to allow yourself to have a little bit of grief and sadness about that, because you're allowed to be both. We're excited for that animal and their new life and that new opportunity. We're also allowed to be sad because we're bummed because we liked them a lot. So I think that that is definitely true there as well.
Thank you, Valerie. And I'd say one other comment on that. Also, a leadership factor here in that you can talk to your supervisors about support when there are things that happen that are really, really tough to deal with. How can you all build the support for each other within the shelter? Because, yeah, it is so hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Last question is, would you consider those dealing firsthand with cruelty cases be more direct PTSD or STS, as you're putting yourself in the animal's shoes rather than another person's story?
Mm, I think there's not necessarily like a measure of more or less. Because again, PTSD is you're experiencing it. So you're part of the actual traumatic event, versus the secondary traumatic stress or the vicarious trauma where we are hearing the story. Also, too, there's been research too, even in forensics, people watching videos, seeing pictures of crime scenes and things like that is still considered STS and vicarious trauma. So I don't know that it necessarily matters what vantage point that we are putting ourselves in as far as what was the human's motive, what was the animal's experience. I think it really is just hearing the story, no matter what side, that you feel like you're on in that case or who you're trying to defend necessarily when it is something a little bit more traumatic surrounding cruelty. But I think yeah, either way, it's going to be hard. And I don't think it matters necessarily which one, but it's just that influx of how many of these cases are you dealing with? What are your supports to work through them? Do you have debrief time? Is there a cap on how many you're allowed to be exposed to, and like how many staff are there, so that we can kind of spread things out and things like that too? So I think that those are some ways you can try to support yourself in those times as well.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks to all of you for watching today's webcast.